Okay, welcome to our final session of the first day of the conference. I hope you felt free to help yourself to multiple rounds at the hors d'oeuvres table. My name is John Pittard. I'm a professor, teach philosophy of religion here at Yale Divinity School. And it's my real pleasure this evening to introduce our second keynote speaker, Professor Manuel Vargas, who is a professor of philosophy at UC San Diego. And among the areas that he specializes in are moral responsibility, free will, historical Mexican philosophy, contemporary Latino-Latina philosophy. His 2013 book, which I've gained a lot from reading, Building Better Beings, A Theory of Moral Responsibility, won the APA's, that's the American Philosophical Association's Book Prize in 2015. And a couple of years ago, or maybe less, I had the opportunity to hear him deliver a fascinating lecture, which was entitled Advice to Philosophers in the Twilight of Christendom. And the paper based on that lecture won the 2024 Alvin Plantinga Prize. So it's a delight to have him here and encourage him to think about how his work extends into issues dealing with artificial intelligence. So please join me in welcoming Professor Vargas.
Thanks, and thank you all for being here, in part because after a long day of conferencing and then you eat a meal and then somebody's like, now go to a philosophy talk. So I appreciate you being here despite all of that, and this is one of those talks that'll go better the more wine you have, so please, if halfway in between you feel a little bit of thirst, help yourself. Okay, so artificially intelligent agents are poised to become ubiquitous features of everyday lives. This is a thing I think all of us here readily recognize. And while there are some familiar moral concerns with how AI is being developed and deployed, I think there's a hidden cost as well, one with profound consequences for our moral life. And this talk is going to be about the how and the why of that hidden cost and whether there are ways we might prevent the worst effects of it. Technologies, of course, are not deployed in a vacuum, so I'm going to begin with some remarks about our present context. At the core of my account is a picture of what we can think of as the ecological nature of moral responsibility, and the ways in which artificially intelligent systems are likely to damage important aspects of that ecology. When we attend to the ecological realities of moral agency, I think these costs come into relief in a way that's hard to see given the kind of relatively widespread tendency, I think, of many of us to think about human agency in broadly atomistic terms. So I'll say more about what I mean by those things in a moment. If all that's right, though, then I think there's also a theological dimension to these costs connected to the way agency and human relationality are central goods for, among others, Christian theists. Even so, some Christian theists might press the thought that our creating artificially intelligent systems is a way that we enact the image of God. We've heard bits and pieces about references to that idea already today, and that this imaging might provide some reason for accepting the kinds of moral costs I highlight. In reply, I argue that theodicies provide a useful, if perhaps surprising, resource for thinking about why deployment of current AI systems actually suggests something like the opposite. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so for present purposes, I'm going to employ a pretty capacious notion of AI, and I just want to mark recognition that AI is a term that picks out a wide range of different kinds of technologies that are designed to do different sorts of things. And so here I'm going to use this notion capaciously to include relatively narrowly tailored versions of artificially intelligent systems. For example, those things that predict what word you might type next or make recommendations about how you can next give Jeff Bezos your money. But all wide-ranging systems that aspire to approximate or someday achieve what's sometimes called AGI, or artificial general intelligence, these are all things I want to count as in the basket of what I'm talking about. And of special interest in what follows are agentic artificial systems, or autonomous systems that make decisions and perform tasks without active and direct human intervention. Now, the active and direct human intervention piece is actually pretty important here. As Shannon Valor and others have noted, every existing AI system requires, among other things, a team of regular human interveners who maintain and support the ongoing operations of any artificially intelligent system, to train it, to patch the system when it goes awry, and to keep the underlying infrastructure of servers and cooling systems functioning. This latter thought about the way AI is functionally dependent on wider arrangements of the material and social world, I think is actually a very important thought. Our artifactual tools are deployed in a physical and frequently social context. Those social contexts are themselves structured in a variety of ways, not just by the arrangement of physical resources, but also in the structure of social norms, meanings, and values. In that spirit, it can be useful to think of these things as social technologies. Social technologies in the present sense are relatively stable, routinized ways of organizing the social world, with the aim of efficiently securing particular goods. Some of these are relatively informal, such as practices of greeting one another. That's a social technology in my usage. Others are more formal, though. These include things like legal systems, organized sports, bureaucracies, international systems of finance. Formal social technologies are often bureaucratic as a way of efficiently managing complexity. Indeed, the animating basis for most bureaucracies is an ambition of efficiently producing a kind of principled order over the domain governed by the bureaucracy. On the Weberian model, this rational efficiency is secured by, among other things, hierarchical authority structures, impersonal rules, and narrowly specialized roles. And at least for the purposes of the bureaucracy, the occupants of those roles are ideally readily substitutable, especially if the tasks are sufficiently partitioned and routinized, or there are other mechanisms for reliably producing qualified role occupants. That's part of the power of bureaucracies, is they're designed to produce and reproduce that substitutability. Now, these features stand in a reciprocal relationship with contemporary market forces. For example, employers are under pressure to deliver efficient production of services and goods. This leads to an interest in securing the advantages that come with economies of scale, and in turn, this triggers pressures towards bureaucratization as a rational strategy for managing the complexity that emerges as businesses scale up. Of course, once a business or industry has grown enough, it creates pressure to shape law, finance, and education in ways that serve the interests of those bureaucracies and their markets. It is in this context that the widespread adoption of artificially intelligent systems seems inevitable. As a recent marketing campaign insists, AI systems promise to enable employers to stop hiring humans. So some of you may have seen some of these ads banging around, especially if you spend any time in San Francisco. In contrast to messy, demanding, and complicated human beings, AI employees won't complain about work-life balance. They won't call in sick, and they won't resist the management's mandates. The businesses employing AI agents will be able to deliver their goods in a maximally efficient way. Welcome or not, the power of markets and the instrumental rationality of bureaucracies is difficult to resist, as anyone knows who's been in a university or really anywhere else the past 20, 30 years. So in what follows, I'm going to take this actually to be a relatively fixed feature about our present and the near to medium term. I'm going to presume that first, the power of markets and the logic of bureaucracies is such that we should expect artificially intelligent systems will be an increasingly ubiquitous feature of our lives. Second, the deployment of this technology is going to entail a variety of trade-offs. And third, there's reasons to think that some of those trade-offs involve morally significant goods. For better or worse, these goods tend not to be priced into bureaucratic and economic assessments of the evaluative trade-offs of technology. With these thoughts in mind, I want to turn to some distinctive, morally significant costs to the proliferation of agentic artificial systems. A variety of these are readily recognizable. They include, amongst other things, environmental costs, the loss of employment in industries where AI can replace employees. I guess that's the utopia that's promised to us by Silicon Valley right now. And consequent effects to the local tax base that fund schools, services, and the like, and the differential access to more and less sophisticated AI systems that offer different kinds of protection or advantage to the material and economic interests of those who can afford the more sophisticated versions of those AIs. These are all serious issues that merit ongoing attention and concern. Here, though, I wish to focus on what seems to me some less well-appreciated ways in which AI systems are interacting with our moral psychology, or those aspects of our psychology is concerned with and partly constitutive of the moral dimensions of our everyday lives. In what follows, I focus on three issues. First, mutuality. Second, the ecological nature of our moral agency. And third, what I'm going to call moral skillfulness. The force of these considerations is that in the wider environment of our extensively technology-conditioned life, the ways in which AI technology will come to mediate our relationships with some of the most powerful social forces we encounter is such that it will undermine important aspects of our own moral agency. So that's the dire story I'm going to try to convince you of in the next 20 or so minutes. All right, so I want to start off, though, with a true story. This is a true story. A friend of mine who read an early draft of this paper, got to the end and he's like, wait, did that really happen? You have to tell everybody it's a true story, otherwise they're going to think it's another philosophy example where you're just making stuff up. Okay, so really it's about Steve the Barber. And you can see that's his name, Steve the Barber. Okay, so Steve, my barber, he likes to travel. We often chat, actually, and if any of you are in San Diego at some point in time and need a haircut, he's terrific. So Steve likes to travel, and we often talk about our respective travel plans when he's cutting my hair. During the most recent haircut, about a week ago, after the usual discussion about the weather and our respective estimations of the local baseball team, go Padres, I asked him where he was thinking of going for his next vacation. He told me, and in turn he asked me where I was going next for work. I mentioned I was headed to Connecticut to give this talk. He asked where, and I told him. His face lit up. Is that the place where they train theologians? I've never had anybody say that to me before. I said it was, and it turned out to be a prelude to a surprisingly intimate conversation. Steve told me how a long time ago he had founded a small church in Yuma, Arizona. After years of growing the congregation, he ultimately decided he needed to step down to avoid the scandal of his impending divorce. It was, he said, a really low period spiritually. He quit ministering and moved to San Diego to rebuild his life and to cut my hair. He went on to tell me that he'd recently gone back to Yuma for the first time in many decades. There he learned that the church he had founded was going strong. Indeed, it was from that seed that a member of that congregation had gone on and founded yet another church. The ongoing existence of both congregations was something that really moved him. His voice and demeanor suggested that the tremendous pain and loss he had felt about that period of life might have, in the end, been redeemed by the way things had turned out for that congregation and community in Yuma. When we were finishing, he said with a big grin, "When you get to Yale, you can tell them about me." Steve took a chance in sharing something about his life that was both painful and important to him, with someone he didn't really know, but with whom he thought there might be a moment of mutual recognition, interest, and appreciation. In so sharing a story, he was hoping it would be heard by someone with a degree of interiority, someone who knew what it means to feel shame, loss, and fear, but also meaningfulness and redemption. He decided to risk a kind of interpersonal relatedness in inviting me in from the conversationally safe world of everyday economic relations to the private sphere of deeply personal meaning and value. There was something distinctly vulnerable, one might say deeply human, about the whole thing. Now, Steve's story illustrates our interest in a kind of relationality that requires more than knowing a collection of true propositions about someone. It involves a suite of characteristically reciprocal affective and evaluative orientations, such that both parties engage with each other in an affectively and evaluatively valenced way. We recognize that another's emotional and evaluative orientations can generate highly contextualized reasons and concerns. There's a web of tacit significances that arise from sensitivity and recognition of another's affective and evaluative orientation. For example, a non-Christian might readily recognize that one might wish to rebuild a life somewhere after a divorce, without understanding at all why it might be a matter of special shame and scandal for a Christian pastor to divorce. When Steve talked about feeling spiritually low, but later heartened by the decades later success of his church, he wasn't just transmitting propositional content out to the world. He was also seeking recognition of how and why it would have been especially meaningful to him that despite his doubts at the time and his departure from that ministry, there was something there that seemed unexpectedly providential. My response could affirm, ignore, or undermine his reading of how things worked out. The subjectivity or interiority required in this kind of mutuality, I think, is non-severable and often a constitutive element of various aspects of diverse moral and social notions, including friendship, at least human versions of love, guilt, and forgiveness. And of course, these things are things that artificially intelligent systems do not currently do or possess. Some LLMs, ChatGPT, for example, can impressively mimic some of the dialogic aspects of our mutuality, but mimicry is just that. An LLM simulation of discourse is ultimately decoupled from the reasons, affect, and evaluations of its interlocutor. It has no view about how things are and ought to be. It has no standpoint to speak of that might permit it to interpret and evaluate its interlocutor's affective import into reasons for it and its interlocutor. Now, perhaps there someday will be such systems. I'm agnostic. Still, we do well to recognize that assessing that possibility isn't simply a matter of extrapolating from the current trajectory of technology. This is the great myth, I think, that at least in Silicon Valley they're happy to sell you. Among other things, it requires helping oneself to answers to difficult and far from settled questions about the nature of minds, about consciousness, about the basis for assessing whether radically different substrates, silicon versus organic, make a difference to functional and causal powers of information processing. The kind of mutuality at stake in interpersonal relations isn't simply a matter of relating to one another or to another being with interiority. It involves something we can think of as dialogic reasoning, or a kind of bi- or multilateral recognition, exchange, and construction of reasons. When I interact with a tool, there's a one-way rational relationship, even when the tool gives me a convincing simulacra of reasons. That tool either serves my purposes or it doesn't. In the kind of interpersonal relationship of mutuality within which we are presently concerned, the rational relationship is at least a two-way relationship in that the agents are providing each other with reasons, or the potential basis of non-instrumental reasons that can impinge on the other party's assessment of what is valuable and what is to be pursued. So the mutuality we value involves both a kind of interiority in our interlocutor and a mutual vulnerability to reasons sourced in another agent. Now, I know I'm going to get questions about vulnerability and what do I mean here. I'm happy to talk about that. All right. So here I want to shift gears for a moment to talk a little bit about what I'm going to call moral ecology. So consider two different ways of modeling human agency. On one model, we can model choices, freedom, autonomy, and the moral quality of acts in terms of the relevant features of a person's psychology. This picture emphasizes internal features of individual agents, and it was and continues to be prominent in various social sciences, as well as important in strands of philosophy. For example, 20th century philosophy of action up until about like 94 was almost entirely atomistic in the sense in which I'm talking about. Call this the atomistic picture of human agency, or if you prefer, if you're a social scientist, methodological individualism about agency. That's the term that gets thrown around, the elegant and beautiful term that gets thrown around in sociology. On this view, what explains a decision is to be found inside the psychology of the agent, understood as an isolated psychological individual. On another way of modeling human decision-making, call it ecological, we need to know more than just the psychological features of the agent. We need to know something about the context in which the agent is operating. For example, we need to know what kinds of options are presented as salient or afforded to the agent in the environment. We need to know whether the considered person is under rational pressure to exploit short-term gains or to favor deferred gratification. Instability, scarcity in the environment, these things matter for these kinds of assessments. More generally, these considerations point to the importance of the quality of options available to agents. For example, coercion isn't simply a matter of being threatened, but of whether the threat leaves open reasonable alternatives. Being dominated isn't simply a matter of being subject to outcomes one doesn't like, but about whether one is subject to arbitrary impositions of costs on those different choices. Being oppressed isn't simply a matter of some characteristic psychology, but about being subjected to unjust treatment, social relations, or distributions of opportunities. Now, I favor an ecological conception of agency. If you want to fight about that, I'm happy to. No, not physically, please don't. I'm going to lose that one. But happy to talk about further motivations for this sort of picture. But the animating idea is that if we wish to understand agency, perhaps especially moral agency, we need to pay attention to those circumstances external to a given agent that affect that agent's ability to develop, sustain, and update their orientation to morality. Now, a full account of the way in which agency can be supported or undermined by different arrangements of our moral ecology exceeds the scope of this talk this evening. I asked if I could have 6 hours, one more than the 5. I was told I couldn't have it. So the basic approach here, I think, though, can be put relatively straightforwardly. We develop our moral dispositions and sensibilities in part by witnessing norm-structured behavior, and by internalizing tacit or explicit explanations about why some behaviors are valuable or not. We internalize norms partly in light of the foregoing, but also in anticipation of criticism and approbation. In turn, we're judged for whether we reflexively generate the appropriate responses or instead whether we seem to be calculating or dissembling about our grasp of the relevant norms. Mature participation in responsibility practices subjects us to additional pressures to justify and account for the choices we make, on pain of loss of social esteem and standing if we fail to do so in an adequate way. More generally, the structure of social opportunities, roles, and expectations provide us with opportunities to sustain or abandon morally valenced dispositions and behavior. A social world that valorizes cruelty or indifference to promise-keeping creates different possibilities for sustaining dispositions to kindness and fidelity than a world that valorizes mercy and integrity. The configuration of local norms and institutions can alter the channels by which we find and experience kinship and fellow feeling. Sharp divisions of class or identity can cause us to hold our fellow persons at a distance and to dismiss the authority or relevance in the enterprise of determining which values we ought to have and how best to enact them. In contrast, proximity, trust, and narratives of shared identity can enable moments of mutual recognition. Successful moral, social, and political coalitions typically work by providing individuals with the hermeneutical resources to see themselves as sharing an identity or social position with others. And in a context of sufficient trust, especially where there's a threshold of mutual respect and vulnerability to the regard of the other parties, we can refine, extend, and even transform our moral commitments in sometimes radical ways. Here, too, though, ecology matters. A world strictly governed by tradition will approach that process differently than a world that valorizes novelty and denigrates tradition. So too will differences in enthusiasm for dialogue and reasons-giving alter the ways in which that process unfolds. Ecologies that discourage or attenuate moments of bilateral rational engagement impose a moral and rational cost on us. The point is that ecology matters for more than the acquisition, internalization, and sustaining of a moral sensibility. It also matters for the kinds and qualities of opportunities there are to transform one's own convictions. More generally, it matters for the ability of communities to transform their moral sensibilities and the practices and institutions that support those sensibilities. In addition to identities, an important element of this picture of agency involves the prominent social norms, practices, and institutions that shape the ecology of that agency. And here, I think, an important feature of our valuing mutuality reemerges. Communities, institutions, and governments that they all wield power over us. When that power is experienced as faceless, which is to say, incapable of mutuality, we tend to experience it as intolerable. It can seem, and often is, a kind of domination when those collectives can arbitrarily impose on one's plans and powers in a way that seems irrational. In so doing, it offends our dignity. It runs afoul of our interest and control over our actions, and it violates a desideratum of our interest in social community, namely the mutual recognition of each other as a source of reasons or considerations. So ecological approaches to agency are a family of views that admit of a bunch of variety in their details. On the present approach, though, a central challenge for agents is that left to their own devices, they face significant challenges to their ability to know things that are of practical and theoretical value. Simply put, there's just too much to know. Instead, we outsource to specialists, to authorities we trust, and to relatively stable, reliable routinizations. I don't need to know how to model the weather. I don't need to know what the likely traffic patterns are on my commute home or the intricacies of the electrical system in my house if the Weather Service, Google Maps, and my local electrician have the knowledge and are sufficiently available to me. If the Weather Service loses funding, the cell phone towers aren't maintained, or my electrician doesn't return my calls, I'm going to have a difficult time determining whether to take an umbrella with me, to settle on the most efficient route home from work, or to figure out how to resolve the recurring electrical short that jeopardizes the food in my refrigerator. That's another true story, unfortunately. $300 just disappeared last week. I need knowledge to know how to navigate the world, and to do that, I routinely rely on complex infrastructures of people and material, but also knowledge and social arrangements. It's not just our beliefs about the world that rely on ecological arrangements. The same is true of our desires and will. Most people don't start off as having a desire to eat their vegetables. I was watching you at dinner. Coming to desire them, or at least tolerate them, as adults deciding what to eat requires protracted disciplining in diverse contexts. Similar things can be said about any number of difficult tasks that require protracted commitments over time, including academic talks in the evening. Our ability to manage temptation, distraction, and sustained engagement in skillful activity is supported or undermined by the material and social conditions afforded to us. Those affordances include the cooperation of people and institutions. Learning to play Mozart is easier in a community that values it, provides opportunities to practice and play music as a group, that affords people access to instruments to do that, and that provides knowledgeable instruction for doing so. Learning to play Mozart without those things, or in a context where those things exist, but one's practicing is affected by hunger, the sounds of artillery shells, or the distractions of an emotionally volatile home life, is another matter entirely. On this picture, our relatively underpowered capacity for individual knowledge and reliable self-control is something that finds its best realization in a world where it is supported, extended, and refined by a wider ecology of social material conditions. Social and moral competence is a matter of learning to navigate the social and moral norm-structured context, and the capacities involved in this, especially in its more mature forms, are diverse. For example, they involve the ability to recognize and respond to moral considerations. They require the ability to appreciate a wide range of values. And these capacities also require relatively reliable and effective capacities to internalize norms and to manage temptation and risks of temptation. They also require having the sensibility to see and feel in characteristic ways, to recognize and manage moral hazards, and to appreciate how incentives will impact the behavior on oneself. We all do this all of the time. I take it that most of what I should be saying here should seem familiar in a lot of different ways. Now, philosophers of moral psychology have had a lot to say about these kinds of things. They have, for example, emphasized that our capacities for moral life are not simple dispositions that are static, like the fragility of glass or the disposition of salt to dissolve in water. Instead, they're dynamic and flexible, subject to degradation and refinement in the absence of maintenance and exercise. Moreover, we rely on others for calibrating our attunement to values. We depend on trusted friends and family to tell us when we're being harsh or cruel, and when we're being too deferential and insufficiently willing to stand up for ourselves. To be sure, we can overemphasize the role of dialogue and community, treating either of these things as elements that are determinative about what a given individual will do, thereby sliding into a kind of sociological determinism. Whatever one thinks about the metaphysical and theological disputes about free will, and I'm happy to talk about that at great length, I'm sorry, there are principal reasons to resist an explanatory picture according to which there is no proper explanatory role for individual agency. Moreover, from the standpoint of individual agents, there's an ineradicable challenge that morality imposes on us in deciding what to do. There are at least two reasons for this, one having to do with an ineradicable hermeneutical challenge, and the other having to do with evaluative conflicts. The hermeneutical dimension is this. The precise content of moral norms, meanings, and values are often not completely settled in each context. Even if one accepts some package of values as authoritative, that fact doesn't always settle what it means to be suitably reverential, gracious, or benevolent in this and not that context. On the matter of evaluative trade-offs, the basic issue is that one still must decide on value trade-offs in contexts of conflict. One might value both truth and kindness, but how that trade-off works in the context of assessing student work, as opposed to one's assessment of a spouse's haircut on their way to a job interview, might be very different. In both the case of hermeneutic complexity and in the case of evaluative trade-offs, the morally mature agent cannot just take a package of values off the shelf, as it were, and simply apply them to life. Rather, there's a kind of tailoring of these things to one's particular life and circumstances that is proper and often inevitable. Moral competence, then, is a skill. It's a skill that requires exercise and for which the nuanced and mature deployment of it ordinarily comes through some degree of social attunement and development over time. In its mature forms, it depends on some degree of moral friction, of wrestling with and exploring different ways of understanding what morality requires and how it applies in the infinitely varied configurations of inter- and intrapersonal life. So on any view of morality that recognizes that we can be better or worse at it, whether realist, constructivist, or otherwise, our moral competence is subject to ecological effects. That is, the shape of the social and material world can, both synchronically and diachronically, affect our moral skill, and the development, maintenance, and refinement of that skill relies on the oftentimes effortful exercises of that skill. Okay, so we've got several pieces on the board now. We've got mutuality, we've got ecology, and moral skill. So I think we've got now the pieces we need in order to appreciate how the proliferation of artificially intelligent systems is going to impact our moral agency and ecology in what I think are subtle and profound ways. At the outset, I claim that the power of markets and the logic of bureaucracies is such that we should expect that artificially intelligent systems will be increasingly ubiquitous in our lives, and that the deployment of this technology will entail some morally significant trade-offs. Here, I want to call attention to some trade-offs that are distinctively structured by the way our agency is entwined with ecologies. Call those places in social space where individuals interact with groups, businesses, and institutions nodes. In a pre-modern world, nodes were undeniably personal in the sense that the magistrate, the tax collector, or the priest was a specific person. For good or ill, the individuals that occupied those nodes often had a great deal of latitude about how to navigate interactions on behalf of the institutions they represented. Depending on the extent and scope of formalized traditions and laws and their enforcement, that latitude could be constrained in different ways, of course. But still, there was often a relatively robust degree of freedom over how negotiations with nodes might be conducted. However, and it's always a however, as bureaucracies emerged and began to rapidly spread in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the emphasis on narrowly specialized roles, a hierarchy of authority, and impartial rules reduced the degrees of freedom enjoyed by occupants of nodes. Bureaucratization was a response to the scale at which human collectives had begun to operate. The significance of scale for these processes is clear enough if one considers the difference between talking to a local business owner about a bad product and a rate increase, and the experience of negotiating with a national cable or ISP provider about the service problems and a rate increase. It was this phenomenon of inflexibility that led Weber to characterize life in Western capitalist societies as subject to what he called the iron cage of technocratic rationality. Still, this development did leave some room for negotiation. One could impress upon the magistrate the urgency of one's request, and one could appeal to the salesperson to contact the store manager. Even in the iron cage, it makes all the difference that the occupants of the cells are still people. It leaves open the possibility that one's urgent concern might be met with a subtle bit of rule bending or expedited handling, or a discrete pointer to a more efficient way of resolving some problem. These moments of sensitivity to our needs, concerns, and vulnerabilities depend on some degree of mutuality and occasional impulses to act with charity. The deployment of artificially intelligent agents, at least as they're currently configured, will expunge much of the moral sensitivity remaining in those nodes that mediate our relationship to some of the most powerful forces that shape our lives. To be sure, AI systems are already being designed to be empathically sensitive, but primarily for the purposes of efficiently managing the affects of those with whom they interact. If this technology proves to be anything other than what video gamers call a skin, a thing you just throw over, a thing that's basic underlying functionality doesn't change, on otherwise indifferent interactions, then some users will cynically develop techniques for exploiting the differences affective sensitivity makes. Other users will be burdened by knowing that even when dealing with a machine, they still have to ready their affective sensibilities because it might affect their ability to secure what they want from that organization or institution. However that goes, such interactions would again be a mimicry of mutuality. Artificial agents, at least as they currently exist, lack the capacity for the kind of relationality that enables our morally informed relations. Such systems are not designed for the kind of moral relationality at stake in our relations to others. They lack the interiority and emotionally balanced receptivity ordinarily required for it. In a phrase, they are not moral agents. The fact that they are morally insensate creates an asymmetry of moral vulnerability between us and those artificial systems. In some, their replacement of morally competent agents has the effect of altering the contexts where that moral sensitivity is mediating our relationship to wider, often considerably more powerful forces that structure our lives. These shortcomings are unlikely to slow the adoption of this technology anytime soon. Contemporary life is, of course, overwhelmingly structured by our relationship to businesses, organizations, and institutions. Just ask yourself how you got here. The basic underlying logic of markets and bureaucratic pressures will extend the presence of agentic AIs into every place where it seems cheaper and more efficient from the standpoint of the bureaucracy to replace a human with an AI. In the language of economists, moral costs are an externality. But externalities just are those things that are not priced into the cost of adopting some technology or policy, and so these costs will be mostly immaterial to those who have incentives to adopt these systems. The real-world effect of this is that fewer of the difficult moments in our lives will be mediated by agents without the authority competence and control to resolve practical challenges and conflicts in a morally skillful way. Consider, for example, what happens now when one encounters a problem with a connecting flight. I wrote this in anticipation, but it didn't happen. There was a time when gate agents were empowered to and expected to help passengers resolve such problems. The gate agent could have a conversation with the passenger, making an on-the-fly assessment about the urgency of getting this passenger to, say, a funeral or a birth, over another passenger who's hoping to get to a luxury vacation on time. Now, though, of course, the gate agent is more likely to point the passengers to an app on their phone or to insist that they can't do anything more than can be done by the passenger with the app on the phone. Notice, too, the sometimes subtle ways this reshapes everyone's incentives and default strategies for managing disruptions in travel plans. The presence of AI systems means the human gate agent is incentivized to push all passengers to the app. It means less work for the gate agent, and it's easier to avoid the sometimes fraught conversations that accompany harried travelers whose plans have gone awry. Moreover, travelers are being trained to rely on the app for solutions, even if in morally urgent cases, it's less reliable or a less useful way to resolve the problem. This training of the expectations of travelers entails that even in cases where human agents are in principle available and able to help, or where they might have better options than an app will make available, many travelers won't even know that talking to a human is an option. Inevitably, there will be fewer humans hired for just those roles. Now, it's not a matter of the fact that the iron cage will become somehow even less flexible, that bureaucracies, businesses, governments, and the rest will become less humane in response to our moments of crisis, although I think it's at least that too. It also means that we're going to have fewer nodes where our moralized reactions, not just our attributions of responsibility, but the full range of on-the-fly moral concerns, having any hope of restructuring how it is organizations, collectives, and institutions respond. The possibility of dialogue, of collaborative construction of new convergent sensibilities and strategies for navigating diverse moral interests will disappear. What seems more likely is that we will learn to efficiently defer to the preferences favored by the organizations building or deploying the artificial agents occupying nodes. Of course, existing organizations, collectives, and institutions are not equally, or in some cases at all, sensitive to these considerations in a robust way. However, where there are moral agents occupying these nodes, there's at least some chance of this sort of collaborative, dialogic investigation and construction of moral insight. Whether it's an employee noting that it might be a good idea to alter policy to better handle certain kinds of cases that seem especially morally significant, or whether it's the formal enterprise of undertaking an inventory of concerns, internal reviews, synods, public hearings, the presence of dynamic, reflective, skillful moral agents makes a difference to the shape of public moral life. Moreover, to the extent to which our individual skill at morality and its demands require effortful development and maintenance, one might worry that pressures towards bureaucratization with fewer morally sensitive nodes in a world with fewer opportunities for the valuable moral friction that helps build our capacities will come at that cost. If the literature describing life under totalitarian regimes is any indication, ecologies that are indifferent to moral concern tend to have a corrupting influence on the incentives and sensibilities of those subject to life in those contexts. This, then, I think, is the central hidden moral cost of AI systems. It promises to alter the fabric of our moral ecology, and in doing so, to alter the character of our moral agency. The inexorable logic shaping the development of AI makes this threat profound and far-reaching. Of course, these changes will not unfold overnight. Still, I think we're already in a pot with the temperature creeping up. Of course, a critic might contest this, arguing that, look, it's not as though AI systems don't do anything for us. We've already seen that there might be reasons to think that judicious deployment of AI systems might save lives on the road or in medicine or in wartime. And if we can show that we can get less harm, why isn't that enough to justify the loss of some morally sensitive nodes? When things go badly for us and we must deal with organizations and institutions, we might want moral sensitivity. But how much is that worth? What other goods might we be getting with the efficiencies of morally insensate nodes? Now, I think perhaps there are some trade-offs that can justify selective evacuation of moral capacities from those nodes. There might be important cases where we do better, for example, avoiding the bias or epistemic defects of human agents. But I think these trade-offs are complicated in ways I'm going to gesture at here in a moment. I think in general, we benefit from morally responsive nodes, and in some clear sense, this is something that many of us want and hope to encounter in our interactions with the wider social world. There is, however, a further problem lurking here, and that thing is that we often like the loss of mutuality and all that follows. Mutuality can be messy and taxing, it involves the risk of vulnerability. Consequently, it will frequently be tempting to sidestep this sort of relationality. And I think this is perhaps especially so for those of us who are not particularly extroverted or whose social formations lacked the sustained period of non-optional face-to-face socialization that characterized most human beings born prior to the 21st century. Electronically mediated interactions, brief texts, laggy video with poor audio and bad on-screen resolutions are informationally and relationally impoverished in comparison to live human responsiveness with its robust relationality and chronic risk of vulnerability. If I'm right, though, the increasing inevitability of sociality and the loss of risks of experiencing mutual vulnerability come at significant cost to our moral ecology and moral agency. So I did want to say a little bit here about some alternatives, but I think in the interest of time, I should skip ahead. But what time should I finish up, do you think?
We have 45 minutes, so you can go another 10, 15 if you want.
Okay, great. All right, so let's see. Maybe I will say a little bit about alternatives then. Okay, give me an inch and I'll take that mile. All right, so I think it's important to remember, so as you can guess, I'm a bit of an AI techno-pessimist. But I do want to gesture at some alternative possibilities that are still available to us, I think, and some ways of thinking about how things might go differently. So I think in particular, it's important to not despair too quickly. We, of all people, should be hopeful. I think it's important to remember that we can and have extensively regulated dangerous new technologies for the better. We have a long history of doing this in lots of different domains that we just conveniently forget that we've done. It turns out that there's a reason most of us can't make nuclear bombs in our home. It turns out that we've stepped away from doing human cloning. We have made transportation vastly more reliable than it used to be when these technologies began to be dangerous. And this was true of steamboats, it was true of cars, it was true of automobiles. So I think it's not as though we lack the power to alter how it is that we develop and deploy these technologies, though I think there are lots of people who would love for us to believe that we can't do that or we've never successfully done that. We continue to have a variety of tools and mechanisms available to us for challenging and changing our future, ranging from voluntary design ambitions, legislation, and of course the altering of economic incentives. I'm inclined to think that efforts to double down on moral accountability of those who build and deploy AI systems might help at the margins, but I think this is a case where the problem is robustly structural. Given the role of markets and bureaucratic logic, interventions that target those things, that alter, that is, that alter the kinds of structural incentives that there are out there, or alter what kinds of markets we permit, are going to be a priority. We might also seek to build AI systems with substantial moral sophistication. I know this is going to be an interest for a number of people here, but as others have emphasized, I think this is actually a very non-trivial task. First, it might require something like a point of view characteristic of creatures with phenomenal consciousness. Second, the kinds of skills demanded by morality tend to require socially nuanced, emotionally valenced capacities, which again are not widespread features of current models of agentic AI. It's one thing to design an AI system to manage or be responsive to emotional features of human beings with which it interacts, but it's another to design the system to reliably respond to novel, morally significant phenomena in ways that display care and involve attention to the subtleties of context. Even if we could produce a reliable behavioral simulacrum of this, there would still be a loss if we cannot rightly construct a shared moral standpoint, or if our moral appraisals cannot be affirmed or repudiated by an agent that is operating with actual moral understanding. Given these considerations, I think the engineering of artificial intelligence with a genuine moral psychology is an urgent project with stakes for our own moral psychology and agency, but whether or not and how feasible that is, I think is a much more difficult question than is oftentimes recognized. Okay, so here I want to finish up by considering three theological aspects of the foregoing. So one is Imago Dei and the value of agency. The second is the sources of Christian of authority in Christian ethics, and the third is the role of mutuality in Christian life. Now, some have noted that the construction of suitable AIs could constitute an imaging of God, wherein humans perform an image of God's creative act in bringing a new kind of agent into this world, with AI standing in relation to us as we do to God. On that sort of picture, there's an important good that comes from developing and deploying AI systems, especially agentic ones. However, I've argued that AI systems, at least as they now exist and are likely to be constructed through the medium term, one, continue to fail to be moral agents, but two, will be increasingly entwined in decision-making capacities in our social world, and thus three, will contribute to a more morally austere ecology, in the sense of structuring our environments with fewer nodes of interaction with morally sensitive agents. Now, here we can make some useful progress, though, about thinking about that conflict about, well, look, but there's this one goodie on the imaging God possibility against some of these other kinds of costs. Which way should this go? Well, it depends on how good an act it was that you think our imaging God turns out to be. Now, here I think we can make some useful progress by reflecting on the evaluative structure of theodicies. The traditional Christian conception of God holds that God's all-powerful, all-knowing, and entirely good, and a long-standing puzzle in philosophical theology has been how to reconcile this picture of God with the fact of a world rich in unearned pain, atrocities, and injustice. Philosophers and theologians have, of course, offered a variety of replies. Perhaps the most famous is the idea of a particular conception of free will, according to which the cost of human actions possessing genuine moral significance, and again, we can fight about the question about whether or not human and divine action and human and divine freedom look differently, but that at least the cost of human actions possessing genuine moral significance is that it requires that humans must have the ability to choose to do evil things. Mere agency or goal-directed behavior of the sort had by many non-human animals is too shallow a thing to produce genuinely morally worthwhile behavior on this sort of view. Genuine moral worth of the sort we recognize as being at stake in ordinary human action requires something else on this formulation of the argument. Here I report, you decide. I'm not telling you what to think about this. I'm just giving you what the argument is. On one important formulation, it requires agents who, in light of suitable moral knowledge, have the two-way power to act or refrain from acting as morality recommends. The free will theodicy is only one member of a family of theodicies, and whenever an analytic philosopher uses this word, there's always at least one analytic philosopher in the room who twitches and says, do you mean a defense or a theodicy? So if you prefer, hear me saying the word defenses. In response to the problem of evil. For example, other theodicies have appealed to the idea that we could not appreciate what is good without the contrast of evil, or that the existence of evil is necessary for forging certain kinds of valuable relationships between people or between God and people, or that the experience of evil shapes our characters in important ways. Theodicies, broadly understood, have not only varied by the values they appeal to, but they've also varied in terms of their dialectical ambitions. Some theodicies only aspire to explain how it might be logically possible that God could have created a world with the evil that is manifest in our world. Others endeavor to show that it's reasonable to think that there is a morally sufficient reason for God's allowing that evil, and still others strive to show that some moral justification is, in fact, God's reason for allowing what evil there is. Now, despite the considerable diversity in content and dialectical ambition, there's a recurring evaluative structure shared by most, if not all, theodicies. Again, you can hear defense if it makes it go better. That is, theodicies appeal to the idea that evils trade off against some higher good, and where those evils are not just compatible with that good, but somehow necessary for the realization of that good. We can also imagine parallel arguments that invert every significant piece of the evaluative structure of a theodicy that I just gave you. I have in mind cases that undermine rather than justify some evaluative thesis. The idea is that there's an unnecessary trade-off of values in the service of foregoing a higher good for lower evils, and where those evils actively preclude the realization of that higher good. So if a theodicy is an explanation of God's justice in the face of evil, that's the theodike, the kind of transformation of the Greek, and I guess this was Leibniz who gave us this term, we might think of these cases as examples of an anthropodikia. That is, an instance of human-made injustice that undermines the attainment of some higher value. Now, the current trajectory of AI deployment suggests an anthropodikia, an inversion of the specific value identified in at least one theodicy. What widespread adoption of current and near-term AI systems offers us is the loss of a paradigmatically higher-order good, that is, our skillful moral agency, for mere mammon. If this is right, then the creation of artificial intelligence is not best understood as an imaging of God's creative activity. The creation of a form of morally insensate agency, where the creation of that agency undermines the condition for our own moral agency, is an inversion of God's creation. In short, theodicy has become anthropodikia. Now, the effect of AI systems on our moral ecology should be of concern to everyone. However, I think there are at least two further concerns why the likely deployment of AIs should be of special concern to Christian theists. The first is connected to the source of authority for Christian ethics, and the second has to do with the role of mutuality in Christian life. First, on many standard accounts of the authority of Christian ethics, that authority is grounded in a variety of sources: scripture, tradition, reason and experience, or the moral laws revealed in the gospel, the activities of the Holy Spirit, rationally apprehensible natural law. There are different regimentations of that story. Yet I've argued that our moral ecology plays a substantial role in our moral formation, not just of knowledge, sensibility, and the will, but also in the directing of our attention, the population of our imagination, and the provisioning of opportunities for the realization of moral skill over time. Thus, technologies that alter our ecologies in ways that our psychologies aren't built for, or that undermine our organic ability to form our moral discernment, are threatening for just that reason. Crudely, it seems less plausible that the Holy Spirit works through artificially intelligent systems if, by design, they are not morally sensate. More broadly, there's some reason to think our moral reasoning is affectively structured. If that's right, then the absence of genuine emotional sensitivity in artificially intelligent systems should again undermine their suitability as vehicles for moral authority grounded in reason and moral experience. It also means that an epistemic milieu that replaces morally sensitive agents possessed of psychologies epistemically attuned to these things for artificial agents that are morally insensate is not an upgrade to the Christian enterprise of moral discernment. Second, the present account of the effects of AI adoption on our moral ecology suggests that such a restructuring will come at the direct and indirect cost of diminished opportunities for mutuality. It will be direct in that increasing numbers of nodes of our relationships to social structures will be mediated by morally insensate systems. Indirect costs will arise from the ways in which these transformations will plausibly contribute to a growing reluctance to encounter the risk of exposure to face-to-face vulnerability, need, loss, shame, and hurt. I'm talking to my youngest daughter. She's like, "What? We would never call anybody. That's way too intimate to actually talk to a person on a phone." As John Pittard has noted in recent work, this entails that we lose the opportunity to respond to these things with love and care. And here I quote John's work, recent work: Christians have reason to assign significant weight to concerns about relational impoverishment. To fulfill the Christian vocation, it is not enough to merely address one another's needs. One must draw near enough to understand something of their experiences. And one must open one's heart to ache or rejoice with others in suffering and flourishing. The cost of a world of non-conscious AI agents is that the tissue of mutual care and concern that unified these communities would be compromised as humans invest themselves in these non-conscious members that misleadingly appear to be alive. Such relational attenuation would amount to a weakening of the loving fellowship which Christians understand to be an essential aspect of the human telos. This seems to me exactly right. Relative to Christian ethical commitments, there's a real and substantial risk here, one reinforced by wider features of modern economic and bureaucratic life. Of course, it remains a conceptual possibility that even if Christians could hold the bureaucratic and market efficiencies secured by the deployment of AI systems could yet generate an adequate trade-off for these losses. If, for example, the economic and other gains generated by the deployment of these systems could be used to recover or redeploy resources for other goods of great value, this might make the equation look different. If, for example, the provisioning of systemic or collective goods that enabled human flourishing, whether in the way of concrete material resources, or in the provisioning of institutions and practices that enrich human life become a feature of the development of those systems, then the apparent moral costs of AIs might be redeemed by wider access and or better attainment of those other goods. But this possibility, however remote, may strike some as a world worth hoping for and working towards, perhaps especially if one thinks that we are unlikely to overcome the pressures that favor the deployment of AI systems, whatever their externalities. If we cannot bring ourselves to slow and stop the proliferation of AIs, at least as they're currently designed, across our moral ecologies, the repurposing of human and fiscal resources in other ways might be our best hope for ameliorating the problems of AI's evils. Still, it seems to me we do well to have less faith in how these systems will be deployed and to focus our efforts on the works that may insulate us from the moral risks generated by these systems. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. And we have a good amount of time for questions. And we have the mic being passed around. So raise your hand if you have a question. And yeah, right over here.
Thanks a lot. I didn't want to go first because, I don't know, I'm asking too many questions, but this is fun. I'm having a little trouble placing exactly where you're conceiving of the harm to our moral ecology from AI. So is it primarily in that it produces fewer human-to-human interactions, or is it primarily in that it sometimes makes us think we're interacting with a human-like agent when we're not? Or is it both of those things? And in the one case, the emerging norms of AI law and ethics are talking about notice, right? So we need to have, and that potentially internalizes that moral externality, if you want to put it that way. But in the other case, I'm not sure how it's that much different from any other technology that, separates people.
Yeah, good. So I wasn't thinking about the case. I mean, so I think you raised a really interesting question here about cases where people are unaware of whether or not they're working with an AI. And I think lots of really rich, interesting, and to my mind, unsettled questions about the extent to which, A, the extent to which that's true, and B, what the consequences of that turn out to be. I mean, because my guess is that human beings, we're going to settle on some defaults. So our default estimation is going to be we're working with a human, or is it going to be that we're working with a non-human? And I think my guess is that's a kind of thing that is a fungible difference. But that wasn't what I had in mind. But I think this is I think it's an area ripe for thinking about. With respect to so I was thinking in the primary case about reduced numbers of interactions, and I think the right initial question is exactly the one you asked, which is, but doesn't this happen all the time with our technologies? And then I say, yes, doing it more frequently, isn't better. That part of the problem is exactly, I think, this transformation I was gesturing at about how part of the ways in which we've structured our world over time is that we oftentimes are just not noticing the increasing excavation of our ability to engage in as it were, genuine reciprocal moral dialogue where the possibility of moral friction is available, but where there's also the possibility of mutual construction. And so I think we as we've set up our societies, I think it's exactly that the lobster in the cooking pot problem, where it's like, well, look, the first couple degrees didn't do us in. Let's just keep turning up the heat. And I think, no, this is the problem, is that we keep giving up these moments, and for good reasons and good pressures. I mean, that is, bureaucratization and markets have gotten us things. It's not as though they haven't gotten us lots of goodies, but the kinds of pressures that come in that wake are having these moral costs that get treated as externalities. And I think AI is going to accelerate that in a way that that some of these other technologies would only dream of being able to accelerate in ways about transforming our attitudes about how it is that we interact with one another. And I think you can see this. I mean, so this is, in some sense, I want to take on board exactly this thought about, well, look, it wasn't like Twitter changed our, Twitter, or now X, changed the fact that people were communicating over text. And it's like, have you looked at Twitter lately? I mean, there's been transformations in the norms of human interaction and human discourse in ways that I'm unconvinced have been healthy for us. And I think we see this in our classrooms. I think we see this in online discourse. I think we see this in the media. And so I want to accept that, yeah, this is another version of a kind of technological transformation. But I think the trajectory here is not one we should be excited about.
Can I follow up real quick? Yeah. Just because you using that language of externalities resonates with me, because as a legal scholar, we talk about this all the time, except we talk about it in economics. So what kind of policy would cause someone to internalize the moral externality? Like a tax causes you to internalize or a penalty, right? An economic externality, but I don't know how to translate that into moral terms.
Well, I mean, look, the basic economic strategy is fines. I mean, we can put fines on anything we like, and this is a way of transforming something into a kind of economic calculus for things that are otherwise immune to those other sorts of considerations. And so, I mean, as you know, we deploy these kinds of tools all the time. If you want to, build a new terrain, you've got to make sure that you build out enough parks. if you don't build out enough parks or you don't build the things in the right kinds of ways, then we can impose certain kinds of costs on the construction. So I think there are some of these techniques that are available to us, but I do think part of the, I mean, this is, I'm going to speak even more grandly here, and with apologies for, this is an old joke, and sorry, this is a really wayward thought here for a second. There was this old thing called the Philosopher's Lexicon, in which Daniel Dennett would write up these things about characterizations of philosophers' names to, make some joke about the way they did things. And the entry for Alistair McIntyre was, a very large wheel that you put on a device to cover lots of ground quickly. And so, as in slap on the McIntyres. So I'm about to slap on the McIntyres. I think that part of the challenge of the world we've built for ourselves, so broadly think about the kind of pushing of evaluative questions into the private sphere, making the public sphere largely excavated of things where we don't have massive widespread consensus about what John Rawls calls comprehensive doctrines. So in that kind of situation where we've gotten rid of a lot of this from public sphere convergence around norms, meanings, and values, we're in a situation where what we need, or what we're looking for, is some way to be able to speak to one another and to have our interests addressed. And the most efficient way of doing that is the kind of preference satisfaction of the market. And so I think one of the big, deep challenges that we face in the structure of our lives today is exactly this, that our vocabulary, our public vocabulary for value has collapsed into market value. We've lost other ways of meaningfully talking to each other about these kinds of things because all that's been pushed into the private sphere. It's like really weird, like it's like coming out to somebody, yes, I'm a theist. And this is scandalous. So those kinds of things I think are exactly why this is such a difficult question, but I think it's also, we need to find ways to, as it were, I don't want to use the military metaphor here, but to rearm our discourse on value in ways where we have more robust ways of talking about value than just what the market gives us. But I think that's in some sense inflation, $64 million question that faces us today.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was really interesting. I'm loud. I'm really curious how much you want to stand with the claim that algorithmic intermediary power and non-algorithmic technological innovations would you say they have had the same moral costs in terms of moral sensitivity in the interruption of mutual recognition, or would you say that that's something that's distinctive of algorithmic power, that it's functioning to interrupt mutual recognition in this way, and that's what your daughter, or we see in the kind of social isolation that's productive of these online environments have had?
Yeah, wonderful, thanks. This is a terrific question. So in some sense, this is, we don't have a moralometer, so these are hard things to measure in an empirical way, but it feels like an empirical question about which kinds of technologies have what sorts of effects. And so here, I guess I'm inclined to think one of the hard features about technological developments is we oftentimes don't find out what the costs are until it's way too late. Small footnote on this. My favorite example about this is the leaving from landlines to cell phones. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So, yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think this is a fantastic example of this kind of thing where it just turns out. Yeah, for those of you who aren't excited by the history of telephone technology, the basic issue that happens when we moved away from landlines is it turns out landlines, A, they're not as laggy, and B, you have much richer intonation of human voice on them. It feels much more intimate in ways that oftentimes we don't consciously pick out, but that has a big effect about how people experience communication over landlines. And when we move to cell phone technology, which is a lossy technology that requires, amongst other things, a gutting of a fair amount of the kind of the subtle nuance that you're hearing, not quite at the level of full conscious auditory experience, but that alters your experience of the conversation on the phone call. That's why it's not an accident for those of you who are my age or older, where you remember these really intimate, long phone conversations that don't seem to quite happen in the same way anymore. It turns out there's a tech explanation for part of why that's happened. So I do think, there are the cases like that where there's this unexpected cost that we didn't see coming, that we learn after the fact. I think for reasons that you were gesturing at, that AI represents a different kind of threat. So I think, again, it's an open question whether or not it'll be realized, but I think that part of the different kind of threat is the agentic dimension of it. So telephones weren't agentic. They weren't deciding things. They weren't deliberating and making decisions on our behalf. People weren't outsourcing things to telephones. But when we outsource to these technologies in different kinds of ways, I mean, it's just remarkable the amount of faith and trust people put into these AI systems in ways that some folks have already talked about here in some of the other talks. And I think that is part of the kind of the disruption of the moral friction, the mutuality, and so on. And it makes it very complicated to know how to assess these kinds of things. But I do think that's the trajectory of some of these kinds of technologies that I worry about anyway.
I'm curious if you have any imagination or, well,
None.
yeah. Sorry, yeah. How are you thinking about a response to this for the church? Like, I think about the father or the folks who went out into the desert in response to persecution, and I mean that's not necessarily our context, but like, what might it look like for the church to respond to this like really dehumanization that you're kind of talking about? Like,
yeah, I don't have any good answers to this question. Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that other people will tell me what it is that we should do. I mean, we do have, I mean, there's there's a set of fairly familiar options, right? I mean, so you've got your withdraw from the world family of options, whether we go the Mennonite direction or the Benedict option, or however one wants to characterize this family of let's retreat and decouple from the technologies that we regard as dehumanizing or undermining our flourishing, and we can be selective about which technologies we take on. I mean, I think that's a strategy. I wouldn't want to rule it out. I think that there are there are good reasons to take seriously what a life like that would look like. I think there's also I think inevitably there are going to be techno-optimists who find things that well, maybe if we just shape the technologies in the right way, that we will be able to recover this. And I think for all I've said, it might yet turn out that we get conscious AIs that have a standpoint, that have moral sophistication to them, that are, turn out to be wonderful interlocutors with us on these kinds of things. That's a world that I suspect is probably relatively remote, but I think it's not anything that's ruled out by anything we know. And so, tell them I'm not here. So I mean, I think that's another possibility. I think there's also just questions about collectively where do we want that kind of regulation to come from, right? So one of the worries is, if we have governments doing the regulation, then we better really trust our governments and how our governments operate. Oftentimes we are the government. And so, human fallibility is a big worry here, but you could think that maybe, that's a place people look. There are going to be folks who want us to believe the markets are going to solve this. I think markets can do a lot of things, and the markets are really amazing, but this is one case where I don't think markets are particularly well suited to help us handle this in a thoughtful way. And so I think these are open questions about like how do we want to build and regulate these things and where does it come from. I don't think us getting morally mad at AIs right now or at the people who make the AIs is going to do a lot of work. I just think, Sam Altman and Elon don't care what I think. And no amount of my shaming and wagging my finger is going to alter any of those kinds of things. And again, it's not that we couldn't start to move the needle on some of those things, but I think their structural challenges here are substantial.
Thank you very much. Great talk. Really interesting. So I'm interested in the extension of moral decision-making by individuals using AI into sort of the public spaces. So I'll give you a practical example for a case study would be I want to hire somebody to work as a personal assistant. With Upwork, I can actually define exactly how I want it to sort through the applications and to prioritize them for me. And I could use moral judgment in that application. I could say, prioritize people who have been out of work and are struggling to find positions, prioritize people who are underrepresented in the workforce, et cetera. But that requires a moral imagination, right? So I think one answer to that question is actually, educating people how to make moral choices about how they deploy the technology in their personal lives. But would you say that this might be an example, though, of that interface of moral decisions being somewhat shifted from the kind of nodal encounter that you're talking about into something that's kind of like a little extended beyond the horizon of our own awareness?
Yeah, this is interesting. I think part of the challenge for all of us when we're talking about these technologies is, one, they're moving targets, right? So no matter how much it is that any one of us knows about it, there's somebody who knows someone who's developing a technology that's got some features that it didn't even occur to us that they could have. So I think this is it gets at this, so this partly interacts with this sort of question about, like, what exactly is the shape of the technology and how are the ways in which we're using it? So one is, I very much like the idea that we need to get people to be, as it were, thoughtful about the moral consequences of how they use AI, and not just in the, how many bottles of water did I use every time I asked ChatGPT to answer my homework question for me, but also just in terms of, like, look, you can use this technology in better and worse ways. Here's a thoughtful way in which you might use it if you're, going to hire somebody to do things for you. I do worry that part of what gets complicated about these kinds of things is, of course, humans are going to do what humans are going to do. We're going to take off-the-shelf heuristics about what it is that we're trying to do, what's most cost-effective for us, what's the strategy that we think is going to get us the most reliable person to do the job. So, it's like, oh, there's an unemployed CS major out of Stanford who had a 4.0 when she graduated, but is unemployed because AI took her out of her job. I'll hire her to do my grocery shopping because she's going to be really good at making sure that, so those kinds of things I expect to come back into the system. And again, part of this goes back to the general question about, like, how do we as a society that wants to recognize the fact of moral diversity and the terrible history of attempts to try to do without moral diversity, how do we want to talk about value in a way that doesn't just collapse down into kind of market, preference satisfaction and market's abilities to deliver on preference satisfaction. So I think this is super difficult. It's super interesting. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that this is one of the kinds of looming challenges coming out of this tech.
We have a couple of questions back from that table, so we can go over there.
Shout out to the popcorn gallery back there.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So you talked about alternatives, and you talked about being pessimistic, and I think I'm going to be even more pessimistic, because I think the point that you're making here is, well, it shows us how democracy is, the erosion of democracy, essentially. And so I worry that when you talk about the alternatives and that there have been times that we avoided bad things happening, we made it happen through policy and democracy. But how can we do that if that's the same thing that is being affected by the lack of these spaces and the less interaction we have? And furthermore, altering the market won't happen without the policies, but now the logics of the market is what are dictating these things, which are even more impersonal every time and getting more impersonal. So I wonder, can you solve this for us, please? But also maybe thinking of how can we foster more moral agents, or how can we work on that side, or what?
Okay, so I like the last question better because I feel like I've got more to say about that. But I'll try to start with the initial question. So here's the sense in which I think we have, I don't think it's just raw, stupid optimism to think that there are still yet things to be done. So with every transformation comes unexpected opportunities to do things too. And I think part of the challenge for us is to keep our eyes open and our imaginations wide about what ways we might leverage these transformations. And notice, it might not be leveraging AI to make the transformations. It may be leveraging other kinds of possibilities that open for building consensus and community around policy changes or a certain kind of ethos about how these things happen. I don't think we do well to suppose there's going to be one silver bullet here. I think what we need are a rich set of toolkits and an eye for the possibility of things that maybe are not yet evident to us. So I think we need to continue to hope, and we need to continue to work and strive to try to make things better. Second thing, I guess I would say with respect to the how can we build better ecologies? So I think, I think of several different things about this. So one thing I think so one of the things I think that grows out of ecological thinking about people's agency is how fragile our ability is to think with the full God-given powers that any one of us has. And by think, I don't mean this in a purely like doing math problems kind of way. I mean, and being emotionally sensitive and being morally attuned to the world. And I think this is why I was pointing to, the examples that come out of the literature on scarcity thinking. So it's really hard, everybody knows the old Michel studies on not taking the marshmallow. And part of what they've discovered is, we get what's going on in those marshmallow tests and why it is that the kids who succeeded at the marshmallow test went on to have fabulous lives. It wasn't that they were, somehow superior to the other children psychologically. It just turned out they were being raised in environments where they weren't pressured to scarcity thinking. So if you're in an unpredictable environment where you never know when your access to goodies are, if somebody puts a marshmallow in front of you, you just take it, because you can't be sure that second marshmallow is going to actually show up, because you live in a world in which there's lots of instability and insecurity about whether or not that second marshmallow comes up. And it would be irrational to not take that thing when it appears. And if you're in a privileged world where that people commit and things are reliable and predictable, then sure, you can wait around for that marshmallow to show up. And it turns out that these things have these enormous outsized consequences for the kinds of lives people live, about whether or not they enjoy stability and whether or not they have, what the psychologists call these adverse childhood events and so on. And so I think, when you ask about like moral ecologies, I think we actually know a fair amount about the things that make it better and worse for people to be good deliberators and to be sensitive to other people and so on. And it turns out raising people under conditions of deprivation, under uncertainty, under instability, and so on, these do terrible things to our ability to be decent human beings to one another over a lifespan. And I think there's a kind of imperative for us to care about trying to create ecologies that sustain the fostering of those kinds of things. But then I think also there's different questions about like what does it take to acquire and develop those abilities, and then what does it take to sustain them, and then what does it take to like refine them and develop them and do the transformative work. And I think there are different answers to those pieces. And on that last bit, I would say part of what it means is to have context like, I'm preaching to the choir here, but like to have spaces like universities where people can have reasoned disagreement with one another, and the stakes just be truth and the ability to make a good case and so on, rather than being shame or expulsion or exile or being banned or what have you. And so so these are the kinds of things that I would point to as being responsive to that sort of issue.
Thank you so much for a really good talk. So this question, I think, just has two parts. One is a very general question of just explaining a little bit more how moral ecologies shape us, like the how of it. So at times I heard you talk in terms of like affordances. At other times I heard language in terms of like maybe causal determination. Maybe it's a mixture of all these things. So just a little bit more on that. And then in relation to that, I'm wondering if we think about the kind of degradation of our moral ecologies with AI as a kind of hostile environment or a hostile ecology that we're not fitted for. I'm wondering how you think about is the strategy to resist, to try to transform, or is the more likely strategy to just adapt like other sorts of organisms do when they're confronted with a hostile ecology? So, yeah.
Yeah, good. So I like the metaphor of a hostile ecology. I think it's a mixed ecology, frankly, about AI technology. I think it probably does allow us to do some things in ways that are really wonderful. I mean, so if you can save somebody's life because you can identify bone cancer more reliably and faster, this is a real payoff, and this is a real payoff with human goods that I think we have reason to be welcoming of these kinds of deployments of the technology, and I think it's too easy to be entirely sweepingly negative about it. So I think it's a variegated ecology, but I do think it does have the kinds of costs I was pointing to that I think are less visible costs to us in various ways. So I think it's mixed. I think there's a hostile element here to it. I think it's an open question how we mitigate or respond to that. One thing is, for all I've said, it could turn out that, yeah, this is massively disruptive, but then we figure out a way to take it on board and tolerate it reasonably well. And maybe we have to develop new social technologies, new ways of arranging ourselves and what our relationships are to this technology in a way that doesn't get rid of it, but as it were, manages the worst features about it. So I think that's an open enterprise for which we have lots of reason to try to think through those kinds of things. So that's on I guess your second question. The first question about how exactly does how does moral ecology affect our moral psychology? I think that so part of what I was trying to give in the talk was, as it were, a grab bag of a lot of the different features to the general approach. And then we can drill down in different ways. So I think some features about it do look like they're relatively causal psychological features in the way in which I was talking about the effects of, for example, scarcity thinking. So that we've got evidence for. We have good reasons to think that that really does have long-term effects on people, and that you can alter the kinds of deliberation that people do, and that we can do it in short-term and long-term ways. And so there, I think that's just a straight-up causal psychological story. There are other aspects about this where I think part of what I think is important about the ecology here is not that not necessarily that it has to be causal so much as some of this stuff is constitutive to the way in which we think about these things. So in the criminal law, for example, distinctions about whether or not something counts as coercion and duress or not is partly a structure of the nature of the world. So it's not a mere threat. So threatening you with a wet noodle doesn't count as coercion. But what does make the difference about coercion, I mean, of course, theorists of the criminal law have different kinds of accounts of this, but the one I think is the most promising one is about the quality of opportunities that are available to you. So I think some of our moral categories about how we even think about what constitutes those categories are evaluatively laden already about how we're chunking the world and how we're thinking about and interpreting the world. And these things interact with some of the affordance language, because part of what the language of affordances is about the ways in which we and the world are, as it were, or how it is that the world represents itself as offering salient ways in which we can engage with the world. And of course, part of that is built into the material structure of the world, but some of that is, of course, the ways in which we've been trained up to see and perceive the world, and some of that is artifacts of features about our physio and biological systems, about how certain kinds of things work. So a tree stump that is, roughly at backside height, that's a chair for us in a way that a tree stump that's up here is not. And that's partly it's not just how we chunk the world, it's also partly just artifacts about our embodied nature and so on.
I think we have time for one more brief question. Anyone urgently want to ask a brief one? If not, I'll ask one final question. Often a reason an AI system might be deployed is for fairness, say in parole decisions or something like that. And I don't know that I've thought about this loss of the kind of flexibility, openness to the particularities of someone's situation. But of course, that kind of flexibility is also what provides an opportunity for certain kinds of inequity, unfairness, responsive to certain people of certain race or demographic background or whatever. How would you recommend making a decision about those trade-offs?
Yeah, good. I mean, I think so. Some of it is again, no silver bullets here, but I think just to think about the kind of sentencing case, here I think sometimes careful institutional design can do some work for us. So that is, you don't want just everybody automatically deferring to the algorithm. But part of the problem is that's exactly the appeal, right? So that we can just outsource this kind of thinking. So I think one way to build systems that might be more sensitive to these kinds of things, and here I do mean system not in just the artifactual technology sense, is you can imagine accountability practices where there's a third party that, suppose you're the judge, you've got your algorithm there, your algorithm gives you a result, you've got some inputs that are designed from folks to say, yeah, we know the algorithm's gonna say X, Y, and Z, but here's why we think that it should go differently. And now the judge has to provide an accounting to a third party about why the judge decided what they did in light of the mixed, the mixed evidence and the algorithmic response. I think that's a way of folding in a certain kind of pressure for being, as it were, reflective and owning up to the role in which this stuff is played, where if we just have patterns of raw deferral, or there are incentives to having patterns of raw deferral, where the judge can just get to lunch quicker by just deferring or defaulting to deferring, then I think we run into these problems more straightforwardly. But again, I don't think this is going to solve everything. I think it's just it's a local strategy for dealing with a specific problem about a specific kind of deployment of the technology.
Please join me in thanking Professor Vargas.